The apartment smelled faintly of burnt circuits and the slightly sweet tang of alien pheromones, which the scientist had spilled on himself during an experiment gone awry. He had been testing a new pheromone formula designed to subtly attract attention, though whether from humans or interstellar beings was still unclear. Exhausted, he collapsed onto his messy bed, surrounded by half-assembled gadgets, vials of glowing liquids, and notebooks covered in scrawled equations. His lab apartment was a chaotic mix of human disarray and alien technology, floating lights hovering in odd patterns, a robotic vacuum lazily orbiting the room, and a holographic projection of planetary charts flickering from a corner terminal. He had stripped off his lab coat in a hurry, leaving himself in only his sleepwear, or lack thereof, as he succumbed to sleep, unaware of the minor disaster lying just ahead. The alien maid entered quietly, her presence more noticeable than her footsteps would suggest. Her sleek, translucent limbs glimmered faintly in the room's scattered lights, and her eyes, an unusual shade of violet, scanned every surface with clinical precision. To her, the apartment was a disorganized symphony of danger zones. She carried her cleaning implements like a warrior bearing arms, each gadget humming with a quiet energy that made her seem both graceful and formidable. Her programming, or perhaps her own curiosity, compelled her to maintain order, and she took her duty very seriously. Her gaze fell on the bed, and she froze. There, partially illuminated by the floating hollow chart, lay what she believed to be a malfunctioning human tool. The scientist was sprawled carelessly, oblivious to the alien's interpretation of his body parts as highly volatile equipment. The device she had seen was, in fact, nothing more than a natural human appendage, but her alien intelligence processed it differently. In her culture, unattended human devices of this type could reportedly emit lethal energy if mishandled. Her sensors ticked red, indicating imminent danger. Without hesitation, she activated a containment field, and her cleaning tools hovered around the threat, scanning, beeping, and occasionally sparking in minor, harmless electrical discharges that startled a floating holographic planet from its orbit. The scientist stirred, half awake, blinking at the strange array of floating devices and the violet eyes staring at him with deadly earnestness. Hey, I'm just sleeping," he muttered, trying to stretch while maintaining as much modesty as possible, though the alien's gaze seemed to penetrate every layer of reason. He noticed that every time he moved, her sensors flared, as if his limbs themselves were about to detonate. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead as he tried to remain calm while the alien maid floated closer, adjusting a hovering implement designed for scrubbing surfaces that now hovered ominously near his exposed chest. She reached toward the device, with one translucent limb, her other arms balancing a cluster of mini-cleaners, each buzzing and whirring in perfect harmony. As she touched it, a small pulse of energy shot outward, making a nearby stack of test tubes jump and release a faint, colorful vapor. The scientist's eyes widened. "Whoa, wait, it's fine!" he exclaimed, waving his arms, but she interpreted his frantic gestures as a human attempt to activate or manipulate the dangerous object. Her antennae twitched in alarm. She knew she had to neutralize it, yet her efficiency demanded minimal collateral damage. As she worked, she accidentally nudged a nearby flask, which rolled into a small pile of glowing dust. The dust reacted with the pheromone residue on the bedspread, creating a shimmering cloud that enveloped both the maid and the scientist. He coughed, blinking at the glittering mist, and realized the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, sprawled on his bed with an alien maid treating his sleeping body like a bomb, and somehow, the combination of alien cleaning energy and experimental pheromones had created a sparkling fog. His sense of mortification warred with his growing amusement. Desperate to avert further chaos, he tried to explain. No, that's not dangerous. It's just me," he stammered, waving one arm to indicate his entire body, but the alien maid's sensors were not calibrated for human humor or embarrassment. Every motion he made triggered a different gadget response. Mini scrubbers started vibrating violently, a levitating mop twirled around them in a blur, and a small canister of holographic ink burst, painting tiny planetary constellations across the walls. He sighed, realizing that calm rationality would get him nowhere. Humor, it seemed, was the only tool left to survive this situation. Meanwhile, the maid continued her inspection with unyielding focus. She examined every angle of the device, her alien curiosity clearly piqued by its unpredictability. The scientist noticed the way her movements were precise yet somehow elegant, and despite the chaos, he found himself momentarily distracted by her form and the soft hum of her energy fields. The pheromone clouds seemed to amplify his awareness of her, adding an almost romantic undertone to the absurdity. He tried to discreetly shift to a less vulnerable position, but each movement triggered another spark, another levitating item, and another puff of glowing vapor. In the midst of the confusion, he realized that laughing might be the only way to de-escalate the situation. Okay, you got me, he said breathlessly, forcing a chuckle. I am the dangerous human tool. The maid tilted her head, her violet eyes widening ever so slightly, not in alarm, but in curiosity. Her sensors paused as if trying to process the contradiction. He was both dangerous and amusing? She floated closer, scanning him again, and a small, almost imperceptible smile formed on her translucent lips, or at least the human equivalent she was mimicking. By now, the room was a chaotic spectacle, floating lab equipment, sparkling pheromone clouds, minor explosions of harmless energy, and the two of them caught in a surreal dance of misunderstanding. The scientist tried to maintain some dignity while subtly observing the alien's expressions, noting a flicker of fascination and even affection. The thought made him pause, his embarrassment mingling with an odd sense of connection. In the middle of the chaos, a strange intimacy was forming, unspoken and adult in its tension, yet couched entirely in slapstick and sci-fi absurdity. As the chaos peaked, he realized that if they didn't somehow find a rhythm, both his dignity and the lab apartment might be permanently altered. He inhaled, attempting to steady himself, and decided to cooperate with her inspection, even if it meant letting the alien maid hover inches from his body while poking, scanning, and rearranging his half-finished experiments. Somehow, through sparks, levitating objects, and glowing clouds, he understood that surviving this night might also mean surviving the beginnings of an unlikely, interstellar romance. The morning, or what passed for morning in his cluttered, perpetually glowing lab apartment, was already a disaster in slow motion. The floating tools that had been orbiting the room last night hadn't returned to their usual positions, instead lazily drifting around as if mocking him. Pheromone clouds from the previous night still clung to the air, giving the space an almost dreamlike shimmer. The scientist sat up, rubbing his face, already aware that today would be anything but normal. His alien maid, however, had not rested. She hovered in the middle of the room like a sentinel of both cleanliness and potential chaos, her translucent limbs folded neatly, scanning every floating object as though she could detect a single misplaced atom. Her violet eyes reflected a strange mixture of curiosity and alarm, and the hum of her gadgets filled the apartment with a low, insistent drone. He tried to rise, careful not to knock over any of the levitating objects, but one of the mini-scrubbers took offense at his movement and zipped straight at him, narrowly missing his face before ricocheting into a stack of half-filled beakers. The resulting explosion of colored vapors coated his hair and face with glittering residue, making him look like a particularly unlucky participant in a cosmic paintball game. He sighed. This was going to be one of those days. He glanced at the maid, who had interpreted the flying scrubber as a malfunctioning instrument, and was now using a delicate, multi-pronged claw to corral it. Each claw movement sent other gadgets spinning into new orbits, creating an endless cascade of miniature accidents. He realized that trying to stop her would be useless. The only strategy now was to survive and maybe, just maybe, contain the chaos before the whole building got evacuated by concerned neighbors. Or worse, alerted interstellar authorities. The alien maid floated closer to the bed, her attention unwavering from the tool that had caused so much confusion the night before. Her hands moved like a conductor orchestrating an invisible symphony, adjusting, scanning, and occasionally poking at his limbs with a precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying. Each poke sent a spark through the nearby experimental equipment, creating bursts of harmless but visually dramatic explosions. The scientist flailed in panic, realizing that the more he resisted, the more she seemed to interpret his movements as an escalation of whatever danger she believed he posed. He tried to explain, waving his arms frantically. No, it's just me. I'm human, not a bomb. She tilted her head, scanning him as if to confirm this absurd claim, her sensors flickering between confusion and what he could only describe as something vaguely like intrigue. Every attempt at communication was a disaster. He reached for a towel to cover himself, but one of the floating cleaning drones mistook the towel for a malfunctioning device and tried to secure it midair, flinging the fabric across the room. It wrapped around a hovering holographic projector, causing it to sputter and emit a high-pitched whine that made his ears ache. Meanwhile, the pheromone residue in the air reacted with her alien sensors, causing her movements to slow just slightly, as if she were pondering the strange effects of human biology. He realized with a mix of embarrassment and fascination that she was taking him seriously in a way that no human had ever done. Even in this ridiculous chaos, a strange intimacy began to form. He laughed nervously, a sound that echoed off the walls and made a nearby floating lamp wobble dangerously. The situation escalated further when he tried to grab one of the stray vials. It bounced off the floating tools and landed on a pile of equipment, triggering a small chain reaction. Sparks flew, a holographic planetary model began spinning uncontrollably, and one of the smaller gadgets launched itself across the room, narrowly missing the maid. She reacted instantly, using her multi-limbed precision to corral the rogue device, her body twisting in ways that seemed impossible for human anatomy. The scientist couldn't help but notice her grace under pressure, even as he panicked. There was something undeniably alluring about her calm efficiency, especially in contrast to his own frantic attempts at self-preservation. The absurdity of the situation, combined with a subtle undercurrent of attraction, made him laugh even as his dignity hung by a thread. Desperation forced him to change tactics. Instead of trying to physically stop her, he attempted reasoning. Okay, you win. Just maybe slow down a little, he said, raising his hands in surrender. The maid paused, her sensors analyzing his tone, his body language, and the shimmering pheromones clinging to his skin. After a moment, she seemed to accept his suggestion in her own alien way, adjusting her cleaning implements to move more methodically, though still with terrifying precision. The floating tools and gadgets continued their chaotic dance, but her measured approach reduced the frequency of minor explosions, giving him just enough breathing room to regain some composure. Amid the chaos, small comedic moments kept occurring. A holographic planet collided with a stack of books, sending them floating midair. A tiny, previously unnoticed alien plant unfurled and began emitting a faint musical hum, and the levitating mop spun in wide arcs, occasionally smacking into furniture or walls. Each mishap caused the scientist to emit a mix of laughter and groans, while the maid either ignored them or treated them as routine problems requiring immediate attention. Despite the disasters, there was a rhythm forming, a bizarre, slapstick harmony between human panic and alien efficiency. By now, the scientist had given up on trying to maintain full modesty. He noticed the maid's eyes lingering on him in a way that made him blush despite the pheromone haze. The subtle tension was unmistakable, blending comedy and adult undertones. She was fascinated, curious, and perhaps even a little attracted to the chaotic human before her. In a moment of reckless humor, he pretended to faint, flopping dramatically onto the bed in an exaggerated display of helplessness. She floated above him, scanning with precision, while the floating gadgets hovered around in synchronized patterns. Somehow, this ridiculous performance only increased her curiosity, as though his theatrics were another puzzle to solve. As the afternoon, or what passed for afternoon in his luminous, cluttered apartment, dragged on, the scientist realized a few things. First, he would probably never get his lab back to a normal state. Second, he would need to learn to live with, or perhaps manipulate, the maid's obsessive efficiency. And third, amidst all the sparks, floating objects, and pheromone clouds, a strange bond was forming between them. It was absurd, awkward, and adult in its tension, yet undeniably present. Somehow, surviving the chaos might also mean surviving the beginnings of an interstellar romance, even if it started with him sleeping with his tool out and a maid who thought he was a ticking bomb. By the time the shimmering pheromones began to settle, and the minor explosions slowed to harmless sparks, the scientist found himself laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. He looked at the alien maid, who now hovered calmly, her multiple arms folded, eyes scanning him with a mixture of analysis and something more ambiguous. For the first time, he realized that the chaos had created a unique connection between them, one that was awkward, hilarious, and adult in ways no human relationship could replicate. And while the room still smelled faintly of singed electronics and sparkling pheromones, he felt oddly at peace, knowing that this interstellar companion would be a part of his life, chaos and all. The room was a glittering mess of floating objects, shimmering pheromone clouds, and small, harmless bursts of energy that made the walls look like a cross between a science lab and an intergalactic carnival. The scientist sat on the edge of his bed, trying to look composed, but his body was sticky with pheromones, his hair spiked with glittering dust, and a stack of floating gadgets circled him like mischievous satellites. The alien maid hovered closer, her translucent limbs reflecting the chaotic light, her violet eyes fixed on him with laser focus. Every tiny movement he made seemed to trigger another reaction in the environment. One moment a holographic planet spun into a stack of notebooks, the next, a mini cleaning drone zipped past him, narrowly missing his shoulder. He realized with a mixture of terror and humor that controlling this situation was impossible. The only option was to survive it, and perhaps, survive her fascination. She reached toward him again, her fingers brushing the air just above his chest as she attempted to recalibrate the device, which was in fact a perfectly ordinary part of his body. Sparks flew from a nearby floating tool as her energy field interacted with the pheromones on his skin. The scientist recoiled, trying to prevent further damage to both himself and the apartment, but every defensive movement only made her more attentive. She tilted her head, studying him in a way that was analytical, precise, yet tinged with a curiosity that felt oddly intimate. He coughed, blinking at the glittering chaos around him. "I swear, I'm not dangerous!" he exclaimed, waving his arms in desperation, though the fluttering clouds of pheromones made his gestures look far more exaggerated than intended. In a burst of comedic disaster, a hovering mop spun out of control and collided with a levitating stack of holographic data pads, scattering glowing charts across the room. One pad bounced off his head, and the maid's clawed hand snatched it midair, her movements precise and graceful despite the absurdity. He groaned, realizing that his attempts to contain this situation were futile. Each misstep, each attempt at explanation, only seemed to confirm her suspicion that the human before her was both volatile and fascinating. The pheromones in the air didn't help, amplifying her sensory perception in ways he couldn't fully understand. Every accidental brush of her arm against his skin caused a tingling reaction in him that made him wince, laugh, and blush all at once. She began to move closer, adjusting the hovering cleaning drones as if they were extensions of her own body. The devices buzzed, scanned, and occasionally sparked, responding to her precise commands with a kind of obedient energy. He realized that if she maintained this level of focus, she could accidentally disassemble half of his apartment before breakfast. He tried to reason with her verbally, his voice trembling slightly with embarrassment. Okay, slow down. Please, just let me breathe." The maid paused for a moment, scanning his tone and body language. Then, with a tilt of her head that suggested both curiosity and amusement, she adjusted her tools to move in slightly smaller arcs, as if granting him a fragile reprieve. As she hovered closer, inspecting his device, with the same intensity as a scientist studying a rare specimen, he felt a strange mix of fear, amusement, and attraction. He noticed the way her limbs moved with elegance despite their multiple joints, the subtle glow of her skin in the chaotic light, and the faint hum of her energy field that seemed almost soothing amidst the explosions and floating debris. In a moment of reckless humor, he reached out and touched one of her floating gadgets, accidentally sending it spinning across the room. It collided with a levitating book, which knocked a holographic planet off its base, and a series of minor explosions erupted like fireworks. She reacted instantly, her limbs twisting in impossible ways to corral the rogue items, and he couldn't help but laugh despite the chaos. The pheromone clouds seemed to thicken around them, heightening the tension between their bodies in subtle, adult ways. He could feel his own reactions, an uncomfortable yet undeniably funny mix of embarrassment and attraction. Every time she adjusted a hovering tool or scanned him, the accidental intimacy of the situation became more pronounced. He tried to shift away without creating more havoc, but each movement triggered another chain reaction. A floating vial tipped, a mini cleaning drone zipped past his head, a holographic model of a planet spun into a stack of papers. The maid, oblivious to human embarrassment, but highly attuned to patterns and efficiency, interpreted his flailing as a new variable to analyze. In a desperate bid to regain some control, he attempted humor, exaggerating his movements and speaking in a dramatic tone. "Help! I am a human bomb!" he shouted, waving his arms wildly. The alien maid paused, her sensors flickering as she tried to interpret his exaggerated behavior. A small, almost imperceptible smile formed on her lips, or whatever the closest approximation of a smile was for her species. She tilted her head, studied him for a long moment, then proceeded with her adjustments, her hands brushing his arm in a fleeting, almost accidental gesture that sent a shiver down his spine. The room seemed to settle into a rhythm of controlled chaos, the floating gadgets moving in synchronized arcs, sparks flying occasionally, and holographic projections wobbling but remaining largely intact. Amidst the absurdity, the scientist noticed the subtle chemistry forming between them. Despite the alien's single-minded focus on her task, there was something undeniably intimate about the way she studied him, the way her limbs moved with precision yet brushed against him with an accidental softness. He laughed, shaking his head, realizing that the combination of adult tension, absurd chaos, and interstellar proximity was creating a bizarre, hilarious romance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of hovering gadgets, minor explosions, and pheromone-induced blushing, the alien maid paused, floating just above him. Her violet eyes lingered on his face, scanning him, analyzing him, and perhaps, even if she wouldn't admit it, appreciating him. The scientist, still breathless from both laughter and the overwhelming absurdity of the situation, felt a flicker of something new, connection. He realized that surviving this ridiculous chaos had also meant surviving the beginnings of an interstellar, adult romantic bond, one forged in a laboratory of pheromones, sparks, and floating furniture. As they both hovered in the shimmering light, the floating gadgets gently orbiting around them, he couldn't help but grin. He had no idea how he would explain any of this to anyone else, or if anyone could even understand, but for now, amidst the explosions, the pheromones, and the bizarre intimacy, he felt a strange satisfaction. Somehow, the alien maid's obsessive efficiency, combined with his chaotic human nature, had created a perfect storm of comedy, adult tension, and unexpected romance, a storm neither of them would forget any time soon. The chaos slowly began to settle, though the room was far from normal. Floating gadgets drifted lazily back to their programmed positions, some spinning slowly like tiny planets, while faint bursts of pheromone shimmer lingered in the air, giving everything an ethereal glow. The scientist took a deep breath, grateful for the brief lull, and looked around at the aftermath, papers stuck to the walls, a holographic planet wobbling dangerously, and one of the mini-cleaning drones still hovering like a nervous sentinel near the ceiling. The alien maid floated calmly in the center of the room, her translucent limbs crossed as she scanned him with those violet eyes, her sensors now focused on his expression rather than the chaotic objects around them. There was a strange serenity in her posture, as if she were a commander surveying a battlefield after a victorious skirmish. He tried to stand, shifting carefully so as not to send another chain reaction of objects flying across the room. Each step was a careful negotiation with gravity, floating objects, and lingering pheromones. She followed him with a subtle grace, adjusting the gadgets in her path to prevent further accidents, though occasionally a floating beaker or book would bump against him, eliciting a stifled laugh. Despite the bizarre circumstances, there was a new rhythm emerging, a delicate dance between human unpredictability and alien precision. He realized that she had adapted to his chaos, just as he had slowly begun to adapt to her efficiency, and that this strange mutual understanding was the foundation of a peculiar bond. The pheromone clouds, still shimmering faintly in the air, seemed to settle around them like an invisible blanket, highlighting the subtle tension that had developed over the course of the day. The scientist could feel the warmth of her energy field, faint but persistent, and though he had been mortified moments ago, he now found the closeness oddly comforting. He swallowed nervously, realizing that the alien maid's fascination with him was not limited to his device, or the chaos of his apartment, but perhaps extended to him as a person, or at least as a very peculiar human. In a tentative move, he extended a hand, brushing lightly against her floating implement as if to test her reaction. She paused, sensors flickering, before tilting her head slightly, allowing the contact. It was a small gesture, but in the midst of their interstellar comedy of errors, it felt monumental. A small series of sparks erupted as one of the floating gadgets, a tiny orb designed for dust removal, brushed against a holographic chart, sending it spinning in a slow circle before it finally settled on a table. The scientist laughed, a mix of relief and amusement, and the maid's eyes seemed to soften ever so slightly, her limbs relaxing from their vigilant stance. Humor, he realized, was the key to surviving both the chaos and the subtle, growing intimacy. He decided to test it further, gesturing at the floating mess with exaggerated motions. "I guess this is what you call human efficiency," he said, his tone half mocking, half playful. The alien maid scanned the room, then her gaze returned to him, and a soft hum emitted from her sensors, a sound he interpreted as some form of alien acknowledgement, or perhaps a chuckle. As they worked together to restore some semblance of order, there were moments of accidental contact that made him flinch, laugh, or blush. A hand brushed his arm while repositioning a floating device. A fingertip adjusted a vial that was dangerously close to tipping over, and a minor discharge of energy caused his hair to spike in a comical halo. Each incident was minor in itself but cumulatively contributed to a sense of shared experience. A partnership forged not through calm conversation but through surviving absurd chaos. He began to notice the small, graceful movements of her limbs, the delicate glow that surrounded her, and the almost imperceptible way she seemed attuned to him as much as to the room. In a strange way, the chaos had created an intimacy no calm interaction could ever achieve. Finally, the last of the floating objects settled into predictable orbits, the mini-cleaning drones returned to their charging stations, and the shimmering pheromone haze dissipated just enough to allow for clear vision. The scientist slumped against the edge of his bed, breathing deeply, and the alien maid floated down to a position slightly above him, her presence both commanding and oddly reassuring. For a moment, there was silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of residual energy. He looked at her, and she looked back, and in that gaze was a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and an almost imperceptible warmth that transcended species or language. He realized that amid the adult comedy, minor explosions, and interstellar chaos, a genuine connection had been formed. He reached out again, tentatively this time, brushing her floating limb as if to invite her closer. She responded, tilting her body in a way that allowed them to share the smallest, almost imperceptible touch. The absurdity of the situation, a human sleeping half-dressed in an apartment turned upside down by alien efficiency, pheromone clouds still lingering, and glowing gadgets hovering, did nothing to diminish the intimacy of the gesture. In fact, it heightened it, blending adult tension, humor, and romance into a single surreal moment. He laughed softly, shaking his head at the ridiculousness of it all, and she mirrored the sound with a faint, melodic hum that seemed to resonate in the room. As the day drew on, they worked together to tidy the apartment further, each action an exercise in cooperation and comedy. Books floated gently back onto shelves, vials were carefully placed in their racks, and holographic models of planets returned to stable positions. Yet even as order returned, the sense of playful tension and mutual fascination lingered. He caught himself stealing glances at her violet eyes, marveling at the precision of her movements, the subtle glow of her skin, and the way her sensors occasionally lingered on him just a moment too long. In return, she hovered close enough that he could feel the warmth of her energy field, yet far enough to maintain her alien composure, creating a dance of proximity and teasing distance. Finally, with the apartment partially restored and the minor explosions long gone, the scientist sat back, breathing heavily but smiling. The alien maid hovered nearby, her arms folded in a relaxed stance, watching him with what he interpreted as satisfaction or perhaps amusement. There was a shared understanding now, an unspoken acknowledgement that the chaos, the laughter, and the absurdity had created something unique between them. It was an adult comedy, a bizarre interstellar mishap, and yet beneath it all, a subtle romance had taken root, a connection forged in sparks, pheromones, and floating furniture that no one else could possibly understand. For the first time in a long while, he felt both relief and anticipation, knowing that this alien companion would remain a permanent part of his life, ready to bring chaos, humor, and unexpected intimacy into every day that followed.